Hello, and welcome to Lesson 6-2, The War in Africa and Europe. Today we're going to look at World War II on the African and European continents and see how the Allies will eventually overcome Nazi Germany. Today's story begins with America entering the war. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, most Americans opposed the war, did not want to get involved. We weren't going to fight in it, much like we weren't going to fight in World War I. But the Pearl Harbor attack had woken the sleeping giant. These were the words of Japanese military leaders when they led this attack on Pearl Harbor. They announced that it was a success, but they feared that all they had done was woken the sleeping giant. Millions of Americans now see this war as a necessity and rush to join the fighting effort. In World War II, the fighters included more women and more minorities than in any previous war. Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans all sign up, all volunteer to fight. And hundreds of thousands of women are joining the army and put into non-combat roles. These are jeep drivers, secretaries, translators, etc. Now, the Allied victories begin in North Africa. This is the point of attack for the Allies. Germany had captured most of North Africa early in the war, sweeping through the British and French colonies in North Africa and knocking them out. However, Great Britain had held on to one outpost. They'd held on to Egypt. And Egypt was essential for them to hold because it controlled the Suez Canal and access to the Persian Gulf. The British were fighting ferociously to hold on to this territory, but they needed help. The help came in the form of the United States under the leadership of this man right here, General Dwight Eisenhower, who will later become President Eisenhower. He invades and chooses to invade North Africa first, and landing on the opposite coast over in Morocco, pushes toward Egypt. And as the Germans are feeling this threat behind them, they turn to face the Americans, and the British break out of Egypt. And now the German army is trapped between the Americans and the British. German and Italian forces are then forced to flee North Africa back into southern Europe. Rommel right here was the leader of the German army in North Africa. So North Africa is now back under Allied control. The Allies next need to defeat the German army in Sicily. Sicily is an island that sits between North Africa and Europe, Italy being attached to mainland Europe. They want to land their army on Italy and then on Sicily and launch an invasion of Italy from Sicily. Now, by this point in the war, the Italian people themselves are getting frustrated and angry with Mussolini. Mussolini, in an effort to expand as quickly as the Germans were, had overextended Italian strength and had invaded Greece, where they had temporarily taken control of large sections of the country, but suffered tremendous losses. The Italians did not like this. And as the Allies are getting ready to invade Italy themselves, the Italian people realize that they need to get rid of Mussolini and they need to ditch this Axis alliance that they've been a part of. And so the Italian people chase Mussolini from government. He temporarily goes into hiding, but is discovered and beaten to death by the Italian people. And the new Italian government, which takes over this peninsula in southern Europe, then surrenders all of Italy to the Allies. And Italy will become a staging ground for more attacks into Europe. Now, Germany had been fighting for a time their Eastern War, their war against the Soviet Union. They had tried to push over into the Soviet Union, but they wanted to do this quickly. They wanted to win the war by knocking out the Soviet Union as fast as they could. So they took their one large army, which really could not have been defeated, and they broke it into three smaller armies. One to attack Moscow, the capital. One to attack Stalingrad, an industrial city. And one to attack Leningrad, the economic capital of the Soviet Union. And in 1941, they attacked all three cities, and they failed to capture any one of them. Now, Hitler will refuse to allow his generals to retreat. He believes that the German army must just keep pushing. They will eventually capture these cities. Do not give up. Do not retreat. Do not change strategy. Keep attacking. And for 3 years, the Germans repeatedly attacked and were repeatedly defeated at these three locations. It was devastating for the German army, but even more so for the Russian people. These three cities, especially Stalingrad and Leningrad, were largely destroyed from this conflict. Now, in 1944, because of the continuing German losses, Hitler's generals eventually ignore his orders to remain, and they retreat. And they will retreat all the way back to Germany, with the Soviet army nipping at their heels. Off in the West, we see the major invasion of Europe coming on June 6, 1944. We call this D-Day, the D-Day invasion of the Allies. This is where American forces, along with Canadians and British who had gathered and trained in southern Great Britain, launched a naval invasion of northern France. And they land in a strip of land in the Normandy region of France. They land about 850,000 troops, almost 1 million men in France over that day and the following one. There was some brutal fighting, but overall, this was not a battle that the Allies were going to lose. And once they had a foothold in Europe, and especially with the Germans, so distracted and so focused on their fighting in the Soviet Union, it is not too hard for the Allies to push and get themselves all the way to Paris, where they get 2 months later in August. Now, after D-Day, many of the Allies believed that Germany was knocked out. Their losses in the Soviet Union, their losses in North Africa, had left them incapable of a major offensive fight. But they were wrong. Germany realized that they still had a puncher's chance in this war. What they needed to do was gather together all their best men, all their best equipment into one remaining strong army and just take as hard of a punch as they could at the Allies. And they did this in the Battle of the Bulge, a massive German counterattack that attempted to sweep back into France and Belgium and try to recapture large areas of territory. It nearly worked. The Allied line nearly broke. But in the end, a few pockets held out, and the Germans started to become afraid of being encircled by the Allies themselves and were forced to retreat. The last big punch had failed to knock out the Allies. After the Battle of the Bulge, the end of the war was clear to everyone except for Hitler. Even the German military leadership knew that the war was over. But Hitler still had absolute control of the nation through his Nazi party and refused to allow Germany to surrender. Despite Germany having not yet surrendered, in 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers, the big three, Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, Roosevelt, the leader of the United States, who would not live much longer after this picture was taken, and Joseph Stalin, all met at the city of Yalta to discuss what should happen after the war, to make plans for what the world would look like after Germany. Now, on April 30th, 1945, the Soviet army wins the race to Berlin. Both the Allies and the Soviets were racing to be the first to knock Germany out of the war, and it will be the Soviets that do this, capturing Berlin in April of 1945. They did not capture Hitler, however. Hitler chose to commit suicide rather than be captured, and in a bunker deep underneath the streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the head. 7 days after this event, the German army leaders rushed to the west to meet up with Eisenhower and surrender to the Allies. This is because they were afraid of what would happen to them if they had surrendered to Stalin. See, the Germans had killed many millions of Soviets. Almost 20 million Soviets had died during this conflict, and the Germans had treated them very harshly and very poorly. And these army leaders did not want to chance their own lives and the lives of their men by surrendering to Stalin. They went into the less bloodied hands of the Americans and British. The following day, May 8th, the war was over. And we declared this VE Day, Victory in Europe. And the army celebrated. Well, everybody except for those fighting in the Pacific. The war against Japan would continue. But before we leave Europe, we do need to make sure we at least discuss a little bit here about the victims of Adolf Hitler. Under Nazi control, Germany undertook a program which wound up murdering 11 million people. These were not people who were killed in attacks or in battles. These were not soldiers or civilians killed when a city was bombed. These were people who were rounded up and systematically murdered. Jews were amongst the first and largest target. Throughout Germany and all of the captured territories, people who were Jewish were identified, rounded up, and in many cases gassed. That is, poison gas was put into rooms that held large numbers of them, and they suffocated and died. Really horrific stuff. Hitler also did this with other groups as well. Of the remaining 5 million who died were a large number of Polish leaders and intellectuals, Russians who were members of the Communist Party, Gypsies, another ethnic group that migrates throughout Europe, communist intellectuals, political rivals, people with disabilities. The Germans were trying to create a pure race and eliminate all disabilities. And so all of these people were gathered, organized, and sent to death camps. This is what is known as the Holocaust. And it was one of the darkest chapters in human history. Adolf Hitler had very intentionally created this program. All right. Glad Hitler's gone. That was all for today's lesson on World War II, the war in Africa and Europe. I certainly hope that you learned something today. I'll see you next time. Farewell.